Great, Beth already introduced me, so I don't have to introduce myself. But like Beth said, I'm Heather King, and I'm at the Auburn Shellfish Lab. And today I will be talking about work that I've done through my master's at the University of Southern Mississippi, as well as a continuation of it for my PhD at the Auburn Shellfish Lab on the development of a breeding program for Gulf of Mexico Eastern oyster families using a communal rearing of families. So the Eastern oyster supports large markets through wild harvest as well as aquaculture production along the East Coast and throughout the Gulf of Mexico within the United States, and declines of wild populations have resulted in interest in aquaculture production for all these fine people in this room to support this growing industry and the restoration efforts as well as those wild populations. So selective breeding is used along the East Coast pretty regularly to combat these population declines, but until recently, the Gulf of Mexico hasn't had a structured breeding program for the Eastern oyster. Luckily for us, in 2019, the Gulf State Marine Fisheries Council funded the initiation of the SALT Consortium to help us produce selectively bred lines of Eastern oyster for improved performance in low and high salinity environments in the Gulf of Mexico. So structured breeding programs of the Eastern oyster typically use a family-style breeding program on the East Coast, and that's where crosses are kept separate throughout the entire culturing period. But here we've used a common garden design with walkback selection, and this design consists of producing your crosses, then you pool them post-fertilization in communal rearing units, and following the larval culture of the oysters, they're then placed at testing sites for grow out. And then at harvest, you measure those traits and you genotype the individuals so that you can determine how they're related and develop a pedigree. And that allows us to calculate genetic parameters and pick the best individuals for the following generation. That's the walking it back part. So after the initiation of the program, broodstock oysters were collected from 17 sites across the Gulf of Mexico, ranging all the way from Texas to Florida to create a genetically diverse founding population in the spring of 2020. And then the first generation was produced in the summer of 2020 through a series of 2x2 non-overlapping factorial crosses. That's that little diagram there, and it using 102 males and 102 females from across those different sites in the Gulf of Mexico. And we created 51 half-sibling families and 102 full sibling crosses. Once those oysters reached an appropriate size that they could be stocked into field gear at sites, they were then deployed to 7 different grow-out testing sites in the Gulf of Mexico that experienced variable salinity patterns so that we could see how they performed in those different salinity sites. And we picked 7 sites because salinity is very variable at all your sites, I'm sure you've noticed, so we weren't sure exactly what those sites were going to be expressing through that grow-out year. And then in 2021, we harvested 4 of those 7 sites, because again, we only needed 4 out of the 7, and we measured traits of the oysters, and we genotyped them, and that allowed us to calculate those genetic parameters for that first generation. So here are the 4 grow-out sites that we harvested from in that first generation. As you can see, 3 out of those 4 sites have that variable salinity pattern with prolonged periods of low salinity, and that's in Mobile Bay, Alabama, Deer Island, Mississippi, and Grand Isle, Louisiana. That's the salinity profile for those 4 sites. And out of the 7 sites, we only had 1 consistently high salinity site, unfortunately, so we were only able to harvest from 1 high salinity site within the first generation. Based on the calculated genetic parameters that we did in the first generation, we found that these conclusions, I'm just gonna give you an overview of that first generation. So we found that heritabilities were intermediate to high, with lower heritabilities for the growth traits at the low salinity or the high salinity site. Genetic correlations between sites were intermediate to high, so it showed us that there was very little genotype environment interaction. And then we were able to recover 192 of the 204 founders from the first generation. So that showed us that that common garden design can be viable for maintaining genetic diversity in a population. One thing that we saw as well was that family distributions between the low salinity sites and the high salinity sites differed, with there being families that were only present at the high salinity sites and completely gone from the low salinity sites, so that led us to believe that there was differential mortality in certain families between these salinity environments, and that made us go forward with producing, in the second generation, a high salinity line and a low salinity line going forward. So breeding values, which I talked about, we calculate those breeding values to just kind of give us the value of that individual for the next generation. So we're trying to pick the best oysters to breed in the next generation. So they were calculating using a model for growth in a multi-environment trial model with a fixed effective site and then a random effect of bag within cage to account for any differences among those bags and cages. And then here I've shown the grand mean of breeding values across the 3 low salinity sites, so that's the grand mean low. And then the F2 low is the breeding values of the individuals that we use to produce the second generation. And then that differential shows us how much improvement in the mean of breeding values we obtained in that next generation. So the big thing here to pay attention to is in the second generation for low salinity, we had a 5.39% differential, so the breeding values improved by 5.39%. And then in the second generation high, we weren't able to achieve as high of a differential because we had limited brood stock available to produce that generation. So we were only able to get a 2.61% differential, unfortunately. And then for the control, we just wanted to maintain that breeding value mean, so we chose individuals to maintain the mean breeding value of the F1 generation so that we had a good comparison to look at the response to selection. So the crossing design for the second generation consisted of a 2x2 factorial crossing design similar to the first generation, and the control line was produced in this generation to monitor the response to selection. This only consisted of 25 full sibling crosses, so 25 females and 25 males. Again, due to low broodstock numbers for the high salinity site, we were only able to do 64 females by 64 males, unlike the low salinity site where we did 102 by 102. So this resulted us in having a lower selection differential in this, as seen in the previous slide. And we were only able to use broodstock from the top 80% for the high salinity line, whereas in the low salinity line, we were able to choose broodstock from the top 50% of breeding values. The high salinity line was produced at the Auburn Shellfish Lab, and then the low salinity line was produced at USM. And these are just the 2 different tank types that were used. So at USM, they use these 200-liter research tanks, whereas we pooled our spawns into the 4,000-liter research tanks and grew them out like that. So once oysters reached a size of R2, they were deployed to 6 grow-out sites, including Grand Bay, Mobile Bay, Grand Isle, and Deer Island for the low salinity line. And then we had 2 high salinity sites, which consisted of Alligator Harbor and Indian Lagoon. Those were both in Florida. And I'll only be showing the response to selection over 4 of those 6 sites, just due to time, and I have not worked through all the data for all the sites. Counting and measurements were done bi-monthly, and then bags were split as needed based on volume. As a lot of you know, it's different among sites how you need to manage your bags, so we took that into account. And then the bags were changed out based on best management to minimize any fouling that we saw at the sites. So here, this is the shell height for the low salinity lines, the Grand Bay site and the Mobile Bay site. The selected line and control oysters were deployed, and then the selected line height, 12 months post-deployment, was significantly greater at the Mobile Bay site and the Grand Bay site. So that is that little box there on the right for you guys. The selected line had 5.82 millimeter average higher shell height than the control line at Grand Bay, and then in Mobile Bay, the selected line had 4.33 millimeters greater height than the control line. And we were able to just compare height because they were deployed around the same size when they were put out into the field. And then this, this is mortality at the 2 sites. So mortality of the control animals during the peak mortality events at the 2 sites was significant between the selected and controls. At the Grand Bay site, the mortality event happened in May of 2023, and at the Mobile Bay site, it happened in July of 2023. And the selected line at Grand Bay had 7.96% greater survival than the controls, and at the Mobile Bay site, the selected had 12.92 greater survival than the controls in the low salinity environments. So these are our two high salinity sites. We did not see any significant differences in growth between the selected and control line at either of the high salinity sites. But here, that box that you see there, you can kind of see that higher slope for the selected line. Unfortunately, in the April sampling period, we only had one replicate bag, so we couldn't do an actual analysis of this. But we did see that the selected line grew 6.36 millimeters more than the control line, but we just couldn't do an appropriate analysis and show any significant differences in there. So there was some indication that there was improved growth in the high salinity line at the Indian Lagoon site. And then this is the mortality of the high salinity sites. We had very little mortality at the high salinity sites, which is good for the farmers. Kind of bad for us because we didn't have much selection pressure during this year, it seems like. But we did see that at the harvest of the Indian Lagoon site, we did have a significant difference in survival of the selected line over the control line, where the selected line had 5.54% greater survival than the control line, so that's promising. And then again, we only had one bag measured at the April sampling at the Indian Lagoon site, so we weren't able to do an analysis, but the one bag that was measured there during that time period had 27.13% greater survival than the average of the 4 control bags that were at that site. So the conclusions from the F2 low were that the magnitude of difference between the control line and selected line was greater than the selection differential at both sites. The control line suffered significantly greater mortality during peak mortality events at both of those low salinity sites. Survival wasn't directly selected for in this program, we just selected for growth, so it seems that there's probably some correlated response of survival to growth for that selection. And then for the high line, the selected line tended to grow faster during that final period, but the difference was not statistically significant. And then survival was significantly lower in the controls than in the selected at Indian Lagoon during that final period, which is that summertime period. So it indicated that there was a response to selection there. And then response to selection and survival was less visible because mortality at both sites was very low. Like I said, we had very little selection happening at that site. And we also did not have a high selection differential in that next generation due to low brood stock. So we're hoping to improve that going forward in the 3rd generation. Ongoing and going forward, the variable results across generations, they highlight the importance of having multiple tests. So there are also lab challenges going on at USM looking at low salinity, heat stress, and disease resistance in relation to dermo. There is genomic selection being used in the final generation of the project that's being developed at the moment. And then we'll be assessing performance of selected lines as triploids in this following year. So we'll be able to see how that selection translates into triploid production. And we're currently discussing how we will be moving forward, and it's ongoing, how we're gonna move forward and how we're gonna disseminate all this into the industry. So we're hoping to get an answer for everyone on that as well shortly. There's a lot of people to acknowledge. I could never write all of them down. We have so many growers, we have so many collaborators, but thanks to our funding source, Gulf State Marine Fisheries Commission, and then all of the people who help out over the past 4 to 5 years. Thank you.